In tonight's news edition, the UN chief says he is profoundly troubled at the escalation of Palestinian-Israeli violence in the occupied territories as new violence erupts again in Ramallah after Friday noon prayers. The foreign ministers of the United States, Russia, Turkey and Saudi Arabia meet in Vienna to discuss a solution to Syria but fail to bridge gaps on the fate of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And Jordan expresses its sympathy with France over the death of 42 people in a horrific road crash southwest of the country, the deadliest the country has witnessed in decades. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon described the escalation of violence in occupied territories as alarming after returning to the UN headquarters from an emergency visit to the region. Ban said he was profoundly troubled by what he saw and heard, and that he strongly urged both Palestinian and Israeli leaders to sit together for direct talks. He also commended Jordan's role in defense of the holy sites in Jerusalem, which are flaming tensions in the occupied West Bank. Here's an excerpt of his remarks.
Tensions around the Haram al-Sharif and the Temple Mount have the potential to add the religious dimension to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that could be exploited by extremists on both sides with the potentially dangerous regional implications. I welcome the assurance of Prime Minister Netanyahu that Israel has no intention of changing the status quo on the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount, which many Muslims believe is under threat. I appreciate the efforts of His Majesty King Abdullah of Jordan in accordance with Jordan's special role as custodian. The level of incitement is utterly unacceptable. It is critical for all parties to avoid provocative rhetoric and actions that can further inflame passions in an already overheated environment. It is equally critical that Israel exercise maximum restraint and make sure that security measures are properly calibrated.
A meeting of the Middle East Quartet convened in Vienna this afternoon to discuss the rise in Palestinian-Israeli violence in occupied West Bank cities. Attending the meeting are foreign ministers of Arab states as well as the United States and Russia, in addition to United Nations and European Union officials. International efforts to quell the violence have picked up after 3 weeks of clashes between Palestinian and Israeli security that have left 50 Palestinians dead and many others injured. In the West Bank, meanwhile, Israeli soldiers fired tear gas, stun grenades, rubber-coated bullets and live bullets at Palestinian protesters in the West Bank city of Ramallah, near Beit El settlement, and in the cities of Hebron and Bethlehem during clashes that erupted after noon prayer today. Dozens were reported injured, while others suffering respiratory difficulties after tear gas inhalation. Jerusalem remained calm after Israel lifted restrictions that banned men aged under 40 from praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied Jerusalem, and a large security presence was deployed in and around the Old City. Earlier today, Israeli soldiers shot and wounded a Palestinian for allegedly stabbing a soldier in the West Bank. In Gaza, Hamas held a rally in which protesters marched through the streets waving banners and Palestinian flags. Minister of Foreign and Expatriate Affairs Nasser Judeh met in Vienna with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to discuss the situation in Syria. In meetings with Lavrov came to follow up on a recent telephone conversation between His Majesty King Abdullah and Russian President Vladimir Putin, and as part of continued coordination between the two countries on developments in Syria. Again, Judeh reiterated Jordan's position that calls for a political solution to end the Syria conflict and preserve the unity of the country and enable refugees to return home. Separately, Lavrov, and in statements to journalists, praised an agreement that has been reached between Jordan and Russia to coordinate military actions in Syria by setting up a special working mechanism in Amman. He said other countries fighting Daesh must do the same. And back here at home, Minister of State for Media Affairs and the government spokesman Mohammed Momani said that a military coordination between Jordan and Russia is related to southern Syria and aims to ensure security of the kingdom's northern frontiers. In a statement to Petra, Momani said Jordanian-Russian coordination is nothing new and takes place at all levels. Jordan, he added, remains an active member of the international coalition against terrorism. Earlier in Vienna, the foreign ministers of the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia met to explore a political solution to the Syrian crisis, despite basic U.S.-Russia disagreement over Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's fate. While Russia rejects Western calls for Assad to step down, saying Syria's leadership can only be decided by the Syrian people via elections, the U.S. believes Assad himself is the central obstacle to resolving a conflict in Syria. Speaking to reporters after the meeting, the ministers said they were unable to resolve differences on the fate of Assad. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry acknowledged the fundamental disagreement on Assad, but suggested that there may be a solution and wider talks in a week's time to explore whether there is sufficient common ground to advance a political process in Syria. In Paris, meanwhile, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, said after meeting with French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius that political action is needed in order to defeat Daesh in Syria. France will host a gathering with several allies, including Britain, Germany, and the United States in Paris next week to discuss the crisis in Syria, Fabius said. He reiterated statements by French President François Hollande that a political solution in Syria could not include President Bashar al-Assad, saying a new perspective was needed to prevent an increase in radical militants in the country. Iraq's Defense Ministry said it was not informed about a U.S. Special Forces raid on a prison compound in northern Iraq yesterday, in which one U.S. commando was killed and 4 Kurds were wounded. Kurdish counterterrorism forces also took part in the raid, which rescued 69 people. An official in the Kurdistan Region Security Council said U.S. forces were acting on intelligence that Kurdish fighters were being held there by Daesh. He said the intention was to rescue Peshmerga taken hostage by Daesh, but it turned out none of the captives were Peshmerga. The detainees included Iraqi security forces, some residents, and a number of Daesh fighters accused of spying, and all were about to be executed. And a new envoy to the U.S.-led coalition fighting Daesh has been appointed, replacing General John Allen, who retires from public service next month. U.S. President Barack Obama appointed Brett McGurk as his new envoy to the coalition, according to a White House statement. McGurk, a longtime White House advisor on Iraq, has been the deputy to General John Allen, who led the global coalition's campaign against Daesh since it began last year. What was meant to be a day trip ended in tragedy for a group of mostly elderly people in France. 42 died when a bus and a truck collided head-on and caught fire near Bordeaux early today, in France's worst road crash in decades. Another 5 people were injured in the collision on a country road east of Bordeaux, according to local officials. All the passengers were from France and the region. President François Hollande, speaking on a visit to Athens, said he had been plunged into sadness by the tragedy. The bus was carrying about 50 day trippers south to the Landes region from their home in a village just a few kilometers away from the crash site. Media described the accident as the most deadly in France for more than 30 years. Jordan expressed its sympathy with France over the loss of lives in the horrific road crash southwest of the country. On behalf of the government, State Minister Mohammed Momani offered condolences to the French government over this tragic event, while wishing the injured a speedy recovery. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, said the last days have seen a record number of migrants, especially into Greece this week. According to the IOM, this latest surge of people into Greece brought the number of migrants to Europe to almost 700,000. Meanwhile, interior ministers of Croatia and Serbia met to discuss measures to speed up the flow of migrants streaming across the Balkans. They agreed to organize a direct train line from the Serbian city of Sid to the Croatian city of Slovanski, which should ease backlogs at the Croatian-Serbian border. More than 200,000 migrants streamed from Serbia through Croatia since Hungary closed its southern border with Serbia in September. Tourists raced to get out of harm's way in Mexico's Puerto Vallarta as Hurricane Patricia strengthened into one of the most powerful storms in history. The U.S. National Hurricane Center said the Category 5 storm was the strongest ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere. The storm was expected to weaken somewhat before making landfall. Nevertheless, people braced themselves for the worst. Here's more.
Communities along Mexico's Pacific coast are preparing for the arrival of Hurricane Patricia. The relatively calm winds blowing ashore on Thursday have since strengthened into what forecasters say could be a potentially catastrophic Category 5 storm. The World Meteorological Organization says Patricia has grown very quickly since early Friday morning. They say its strength is comparable with Typhoon Haiyan, which devastated the Philippines nearly 2 years ago. Authorities are doing all they can to warn local communities of the potential danger. Roberto Ramirez of Mexico's Water Commission says Patricia may well be the most intense hurricane the region has seen since records began in 1949. It may look calm now, but Patricia is expected to make landfall in the hurricane warning area by Friday afternoon or evening. Residents and tourists are being urged to steer clear of beaches and take shelter.
Childhood hours spent building structures and houses can be relived once again. The Cincinnati Museum Center will open its Art of the Brick exhibit featuring more than 100 works made out of Legos, from the Sphinx to the Thinker to a flying pig. It's the brainchild of lawyer-turned-artist Nathan Sawaya, who says the art is very accessible since so many people have Lego bricks at home. The Lego art exhibit, the largest in the world, will host monthly themes from Star Wars to dinosaurs until it ends its run in May 2016. Visitors, especially children, are also expected to join in the fun.
So we want to tap into that, and we want to give them an outlet for that creativity and for that bit of their imagination. So we have monthly design and build contests for kids in 4 age groups to build their own creation.
Jorge Lorenzo's late-season chase of the 2015 MotoGP championship title continues on as he posted the fastest practice time at Malaysian Grand Prix. The Spanish rider is just 11 points behind champion leader and his Yamaha teammate Valentino Rossi, with just 2 races to run. World champion Marc Marquez, now out of the title hunt, was 3rd fastest. Rossi was 5th, setting his best time in the first practice session. Lewis Hamilton can live his own American dream by becoming a triple Formula One world champion in Texas. If he scores 2 points, more than Mercedes teammate Nico Rosberg, and 9 more than Ferrari's Sebastian Vettel at the Circuit of the Americas, then it is game over with 3 races to spare. No British driver has ever won 2 Formula One titles in a row, despite the country providing more world champions than any other nation. But Hamilton looks set to make history in a country he considers home from home. And finally, it continues to be cool for the rest of tonight across the kingdom with moderate to light winds. Tomorrow, relatively hot weather prevails as a rise in temperatures in the forecast with highs of 30 in Amman. Light showers are expected in the evening hours, accompanied by southwesterly moderate to brisk winds. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect a hot day tomorrow with northerly moderate winds and calm seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To end the news, here's a reminder of our top stories. The UN chief says he is profoundly troubled at the escalation of Palestinian-Israeli violence in the occupied territories as new violence erupts again in Ramallah after Friday noon prayers. The foreign ministers of the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia meet in Vienna to discuss a solution for Syria, but fail to bridge gaps on the fate of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And Jordan expresses its sympathy with France over the death of 42 people in a horrific road crash southwest of the country, the deadliest the country has witnessed in decades. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Nancy Khair. Thank you for watching and have a good night.